in my book, because that really gives a sort of format under which I've operated. The first one is called The Last Refuge of Scoundrels, which really deals with why I wrote the book and the accusations of being unpatriotic if you don't support the European Union. A very paradoxical argument, but it's there all the time. It also lay out some of my background and really an introduction to the book. The second chapter, which I regard as probably my favourite chapter, is the Irish bailout. The Irish bailout shaped a lot of my attitudes to the European Union. I was ambassador in Canada when the bailout occurred. We were assured by everybody right from the top that we wouldn't go into the bailout, and we were given speaking points, and yet this negotiations went on. Now, in Canada, I didn't have any real input into what was going on, except that suddenly we started getting thousands of young Irish arriving in that country. And I went around my begging bowl from the Prime Minister down, asking for visas for Irish people. Now, Canada opened up its immigration to Irish people. They also worked very heavily behind the scenes to moderate some of the EU bailout. And the reason they were able to do that is that Canada has a very strong position in the IMF and the World Bank, and both the Prime Minister Harper and the Finance Minister Stephen Flaherty worked very, very closely with the Irish government and with me during that period of time. That's outlined in that chapter. The next chapter is Chapter 3 relates to the British-Irish relationship post-Brexit, and I really go in and say there that the links between Ireland and Britain are so extensive that it's very, very hard even to chronicle them. But also that we are playing with fire when you think about some of the activities that our ministers and Taoiseach at the time went on in insulting the British and refusing to accept that they had the right to leave the EU, and to do everything in their power to thwart it. And by doing so, they've actually made the situation from their point of view much worse. They failed to compromise with David Cameron to give him a reasonable deal, and then they were very, very hard line on Theresa May. I quote Seamus Mallon in this, who said, in any negotiations, you've got to let the other person get up with their trousers on, that the person opposite you is often your biggest help in getting this implemented. But they persisted in a very, very, in an unworkable backstop, which they eventually abandoned without the slightest blush. But in the meantime, they had destroyed Theresa May, and they watched Theresa May's career end in ruins without in any way expressing their own regret for the role they played in it. The next chapter, Chapter 4, which a lot of people have asked me why I didn't write more on it, and that relates to Brexit and the situation in the North. Part of the reason is because that would require a book in itself, and we're still working out. But what I say is that the tensions that was caused by Brexit and by the Irish government's response to it have made cross-community relations more difficult. And also, again, paradoxically, just like destroying Theresa May and David Cameron, their actions have actually made a hard border more likely, because of their failure to work with the British to receive a reasonable compromise. Chapter 5 talks about the history of the Irish state's involvement in European integration, how Ireland was very suspicious of European integration from the start if it involved a political union. And the revolutionary generation, apart from Sean Lemass, were all strongly opposed to this. I also believe that Ireland's attitude to Europe historically has been shaped by our antagonism with the United Kingdom and with Britain. And I also point out that throughout our history, the European mainland has promised a lot and delivered very little, to be quite honest. The next chapter is quite a long chapter, but it really goes through a series of areas where Ireland, its position in the European Union is changing. When I was writing for the Sunday Business Post, as it was then, I had to use for Freedom of Information requests to actually get figures in regard to what we contribute to the European Union. Now, most countries are quite proud of the fact that they were net contributors, but for a long period, and I think it was only when we got into the Sunday Business Post and then some of the British newspapers, that people became aware that Ireland was not only had changed from being a small receiver of net receiver of funds, but actually had become quite large donor. And in 2019, figures aren't totally out yet, but it'll certainly be 1 billion, which makes Ireland's contribution to the EU per capita about the same as the United Kingdom. And you know what a furore was out. I also talk about what has happened, really literally the plunder of our fish stocks, and quote Dr. Karen Devine from Dublin City University, an excellent source on this, and how over the years our government has been fairly spineless in dealing with this. We've never called for the abolition of the common fisheries policy, which we should have. I also talk about how our ability to run an independent foreign policy has disappeared, essentially, quoting Emmett, that, you know, Ireland take its place among the nations of the earth. Unfortunately, you know, we spent generations trying to get that position. The present government and the present establishment seem to want to go in the opposite direction. I also talk about defence and how we are being gradually brought into a defence pact, and despite the article in the Constitution, and how even 4 MEPs were calling for the end of what's known as the triple lock, and the gradual erosion of our independent role. I also talk about how the common agricultural policy would be much better if it was brought back to Ireland. We pay a lot in, we get very little out. If we were able to give direct aid to our farmers, it would be much beneficial. I also talk about human rights and social rights in that chapter. The 10th chapter is about Ireland and ever closer union, and about some of the policies, including attempts by Brussels to undermine the national government by operating things like the Ireland of the regions, where they established these phony assemblies, which nobody in the country knows anything about, as a way of trying to funnel power and European money away from the national governments down to the regions, so that the national government will be weakened. I also talk about my experience in Denmark, where the whole freedom of movement area has soured relations between the host community and the minorities who've gone there, and saying that, you know, if a country is liberal and as prosperous as Denmark, this could happen too. If we continue down the road of not controlling our borders, then there's a likelihood that this will happen here. And the last thing we want to see in Ireland is any rise in racism or discrimination. The next chapter, which is a favourite of mine, which is in part 3, is the EU propaganda machine in Ireland, and the amount of money and the amount of time and the amount of people who are involved in popularising the EU. Even RTE subscribes to Euronews, which is 1/3 paid for by the European Commission, and European directorates have the right to run their own programmes on it. So I ask, you know, where does PR stop and news begin? And also the European movement gets very large subsidies from the Irish taxpayer. And I also call on the Institute of International Economic Affairs to become more neutral. I know they're very good, dependent on government, but at the same time, given the lack of think tanks in Ireland, that it has a special role to play. The next chapter is about the Anglophone world and Ireland's diaspora. I worked for many years in relations with the diaspora, and it's a huge resource, and it has helped the Irish government and the Irish people on many, many occasions. But yet, if I grew up in South Boston and tried to come to Ireland, I'm put to the end of the queue, while somebody from Slovenia runs in front of them. Yet these countries have given, in many cases, sanctuary for our people for generations. And I think we need to be much more, have a much more direct policy with our diaspora, and much greater support both ways. The 13th chapter is the alternative policies and options open to Ireland. And really I've asked, could we get a special position inside the European Union? I doubt if we could, but I think we should ask for it, because after Brexit, we will be on the very periphery of Europe, and our 2 main trading partners will be outside Europe. And if we're sending goods to the European Union, it has to go through the land bridge in Britain, the vast bulk of it. So we need a special arrangement. But I come down heavily on leaving the European Union and essentially going on the Norwegian model. And this is further emphasised in the conclusion. The last chapter is an epilogue, which I had slight doubts about writing, but everybody seems to like more. It's a very personal one, and it talks about, meeting people in government and in other foreign ministries who were no more representative of the people of the country in which they purported to represent than the man in the moon, and how my own background shaped my views, and how, in the end, I have a very optimistic view of Ireland, not a pessimistic view. Thank you very much.